Texas Lutheran University.
I want to welcome you to the first in our series of lectures and visiting scholars this semester who are sponsored by the TOU Brown Cultural Enrichment Endowment Fund. Tonight we have Courtney Martin speaking, and her diverse portfolio career is united by two obsessions: storytelling and solutions. She has been called one of our most insightful cultural critics and one of our finest young writers by Parker Palmer. Courtney is a weekly columnist for On Being, a Peabody Award-winning public radio conversation, podcast, and Webby Award-winning website. In 2010, Courtney published Do It Anyway, The New Generation of Activists, and several of the classes are reading this book already. You can pick one up after the talk in the lobby, and Courtney will be signing copies of that book. She's also written Perfect Girls, Starving Daughters, How the Quest for Perfection is Harming Young Women. She's currently working on a book titled The New Better Off, exploring how young people are redefining the American dream. Courtney spoke at the first TED Women event, and you can find that talk published online. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Newsweek, the Christian Science Monitor, the American Prospect, The Nation, Glamour, Mother Jones, Utne, among many other publications. She's appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, The O'Reilly Factor, CNN, and MSNBC, among other major news outlets. I could go on and on with accolades about what Courtney has and is doing. And if you'd like to see more, you can actually go to her website. TELU, because she's such a sought-after speaker, has actually had to wait about a year for her to come. So we've been anxiously talking to her over this past year about a date that would work. And so we are so excited to see her here tonight. I'm delighted to introduce you to a storyteller whose stories I think you'll enjoy a great deal. Courtney Martin.
So I do, as Dr. Olson said, I've been anticipating and planning coming here for a long time, and there was so much energy and work here on this campus that was put in ahead of my arriving today. So I want to first thank everyone who was involved in that, in particular Dr. Olson and Dr. Hoffman. And I just, have already in my short time here had so many great conversations and connected with so many amazing students, and so just feel very grateful to be here. So I'm going to talk about my book and the genesis of it and the journey of it, and then I really want to hear from you all. So be thinking about your questions, your pushback, anything that has sort of bubbled up for you as you listen to me or as you've been reading the book, because we'll have a healthy Q&A at the end. I want to start by by actually uttering three little words: save the world. Where were you the first time you heard those three little words? It's a phrase that has slipped off the tongues of hippie parents, well-intentioned teachers with a sort of cruel ease for the last 3 decades. In evangelical churches and Jewish summer camps, on 321 Contact and Dora the Explorer, even on MTV, we have been charged with the vaguest and most ethically dangerous of responsibilities: save the world. How many of you heard that growing up? Looks like just about all of you. All right. So what does it really mean, right? We hear that phrase and it's sort of said so easily, but what does it really mean, right? Who needs saving? What is the world? Who is the world in that context? It's uttered by moms and ministers, by zany aunts and debate coaches, but what does it mean to save the whole wildly complex, horrifically hypocritical, overwhelmingly beautiful world? So this book grew out of that struggle. I'm struck because I just saw the cake that we're all going to party with afterwards, and it is a cake of this book. It is so awesome. You guys are going to be very impressed with it. So this book, Before the Cake, grew out of this struggle, my struggle with that very question. I left Barnard College in 2002. It's an all-women's college that's part of Columbia University in New York City. And I was really sort of high on my own potential. I had taken human rights courses. I was a political science sociology double major. I had protested in the streets. I had written spoken word poetry and performed it in little clubs all over the Lower East Side. I was really galvanized to sort of unleash my energy and my conviction about justice out in the world. But what quickly happened was I became very disillusioned. 2002, you might remember, was a pretty difficult time in our recent history. It was right when the war was declared, and I sort of dragged my very hungover friends out of bed and said, we're going to the march to protest the war. I promise it'll make a difference. And then, President Bush called it the biggest focus group ever, so it wasn't exactly what I had hoped for. I canvassed, I phone banked, I did all kinds of direct service work. I interned at a nonprofit. I was kind of, flailing around trying to make a difference in the world. And everywhere I turned, I felt like my efforts did not work, right? And I got pretty depressed about it. One night, my family and I went out for a little evening together, and one of our favorite bonding activities is to see really depressing documentary films together. I hope you do not have a family like this. And so we saw this movie called Darwin's Nightmare, which sounds really light and uplifting, right? Darwin's Nightmare. Has anyone seen it? Okay, do not see it, okay? It's actually a very good film, but I cannot recommend you see it because it's so depressing. It's about like ecological disaster and starvation, and it's just like the most depressing possible film. So we get home and, my mom got her signature sea breeze. My brother and I were drinking beers and sort of sitting around the table, and I admitted to my parents how desperate I had been feeling. I said, I thought I would graduate college and actually go out in the world and make a difference, and everything I've done has sort of amounted to nothing. I said, I was reading the paper the other day, and I randomly had this thought of, if only I would write a letter about how screwed up the world is and light myself on fire on the White House steps, like people would actually pay attention. And my mom looked at me very sternly after, a swig of her sea breeze, and she said, I will not stand for your desperation. You are wiser than that. I've been doing all kinds of social justice work for a lifetime. It takes resilience. You're going to have to figure out how to be a little bit stronger, figure out how to root your commitment in kind of deeper terms. And it was a real turning point for me because it made me realize, that I was kind of wallowing in what Martin Seligman, the psychologist from Penn, calls learned helplessness. This notion that when one has grand expectations and finds them repeatedly unfulfilled, the unavoidable next stop is despair. Wendell Berry, a thinker I really love, says this another way. He says, despair is the too little of responsibility as pride is the too much, right? So I had been sort of swinging on this pendulum of having too much kind of an inflated sense of ego of what I might change in the world, all the way to this sense of despair, that there was nothing I could do, that it didn't matter, that I expended any energy anyway. So I went ahead and did what I always do when I'm really confused, which is ask other smarter, more resilient peers and friends what they're doing. I wrote this book, which is a collection of 8 very in-depth profiles of people 35 and under doing social justice work here in the US. And I did that because I just wanted to try to observe them. I wanted to report on their lives. I wanted to ask them how they were defining success, how they managed to muster the grit needed for a lifetime of activism. So I'm going to tell you about these 8 people and one of the many, many, many lessons that they taught me. And as I said, then we'll have a little discussion about it. So Rachel Corrie was the first one. She was an unusual choice in the sense that she actually passed away. She was not someone I could interview, so my engagement with her was kind of like an interview with her writings. She passed away in 2002, but she left behind just a ton of beautiful, beautiful reflections about the world and her place in it, and she was quite prolific. I really recommend her own words if you're interested in her life. She grew up in Oregon, grew up in kind of a hippie middle-class family that really instilled those ideas of save the world in her. And at one point, she became kind of fascinated with the Middle East conflict. She traveled there and started physically putting her body in between homes of Palestinians and bulldozers that were operated by the Israeli army. The logic being, you know, this white girl, Western white girl, they will not hurt me, right? I can serve with my very body as an obstruction between these homes and this bulldozer. And she wrote, one of her beautiful writings says, "This rant is the result of the sinking realization that the best of what we do is mitigation. I can't cool boiling waters in Russia. I can't be Picasso. I can't be Jesus. I can't save the planet single-handedly. I can wash dishes. Thinking it over, I realize that the most powerful action I can take towards societal improvement will have to start very close to home, arising not from the need to leave a mark on history, but from empathy and sincere understanding of the place in my life where neglect exists." And I just thought that was such a stunning passage and so interesting because it actually directly violated what she ended up doing with her life, which was leaving Oregon, going to the Middle East where she had no personal investment. She wasn't Jewish, she wasn't Palestinian, she didn't know anyone there, and basically putting her body on the line. And that risk did not work for her. She died in 2002 at 23 years old, crushed by a 49-ton Caterpillar bulldozer. And there was a bunch of different legal cases around this. There's a lot of controversy over whether the driver really saw her, et cetera. And actually her memory was sort of seized on by both sides. And you know, the Palestinians put her up as this kind of martyr to their cause. The Israelis talked about how ignorant she was and that she had no idea what she was doing. And you know, neither of them were right? This was just a real 23-year-old woman who was trying to find her place in the world, who was trying to find meaning for her own life. And you know, from her, I got this notion that we take suffering, global suffering, very personally. If we're paying attention, you know, if you're not pissed off, as they say, you're probably not paying attention. There's so much going on the world over that should be invoking a lot of anger. But the hard part is, and I think Rachel Corrie's story so illustrates this, what do you do with that, right? Have you ever had that feeling where you read the news and you hear about what happened in France, or you know, you hear about what the Boko Haram are doing in Nigeria, and you feel such anger, but what do you do with that as a Westerner, as someone, you know, sitting here in Texas when these things are happening so far away? And I think that's really something our generation is grappling with. In a profound and in many ways a very new way, right? It's not that news itself is new, but the stretch of it and the speed of it has totally transformed our lives. It's in fact transformed our consciousness, and yet we haven't figured out how to sort of process and act on that consciousness. The next person I want to tell you about is Maricela Guzman. Maricela is an amazing woman daughter of Mexican immigrant parents who both worked in factories. Well, one worked in a factory and one was a dishwasher at a local hotel while she was growing up, living in LA at the time. And she decided to join the military, I think it was her senior year in high school, because she met a recruiter who said, basically, I can help you get money for education, you'll be able to support your family. And Maricela was one of these incredible young people who basically has parents but has to play a lot of parental roles because of language issues. So she was negotiating mortgages and doing all kinds of really grown-up stuff far before her time. And so the idea of being able to provide for her family and getting a great education was really appealing. So Maricela joined up with the military. She flew in her very first plane ride ever to boot camp and actually loved it. She was very athletic, so she sort of loved the culture of the military and found the athleticism really compelling. But she had an experience of being raped, sexually assaulted in boot camp. And she actually tried to tell someone a few days after it happened, and I'm just going to read a little section from the book of when she tried to tell her superior officer. Eventually, feeling on the edge of a nervous breakdown, she decided to tell her supervisor. She turned the knob on his office door and opened it, blurting out, "I need to speak with you." He stood slowly with a menacing look on his face. "Drop and give me 20. In her haste to finally speak the truth, Maricela had forgotten the appropriate Navy policy for approaching a supervisor: knock on the door, stand at attention, request to speak. She did 20 push-ups, tears beginning to fill her eyes. "Now get up and approach again," he shouted. Maricela stood but couldn't move. She was frozen. Her supervisor's voice got louder, his tone more enraged. "Do you think I have all day? Drop and give me another 20. She did. This time the tears fell out of her eyes, splashing on the floor below. She stood. "You figure out how to do it right now?" he asked, just inches from her face. Again, she couldn't move. "There is a procedure." His words at this point became indecipherable to Maricela. It was as if her mind was systematically shutting down, her emotions taking over. Tears streamed down her ears. She saw his hand drop, pointing at the floor, and knew to drop and give him another 20. When she stood, he stared at her in disgust for a few long seconds and then motioned towards the door. She turned on her heel and walked out. Maricela wouldn't attempt to tell another soul about her rape for 8 years. Now, the really amazing thing about Maricela's story, I mean, there are so many amazing things, but one of them is that it's such a testament to the power of the collective. I mentioned that she didn't tell anyone for 8 years. When she finally did tell, it was because she was gathered with another group of other women who had been in the military, many of whom were breaking their own silence about what they'd experienced. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't alone, and she said out loud that this had happened to her. Well, the other beautiful thing about this story is that I reported it quite a few years ago, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, the strides that have been made around holding the military accountable, holding government accountable for the epidemic of military sexual assault has been massive. That when I was reporting on this, it was basically not talked about, and now there's policy going through. There's an incredible documentary called Invisible War that I hope you'll see if you're interested in this issue. There's just been huge sea changes on this front, and so much of it is due to women like Maricela, who co-founded something called the Service Women's Action Network, which has just done incredible work. So I'm going to show you Maricela
I kept this a
here.
secret, and I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I was crazy, and so I didn't know how to express what was happening to me. When I came to the realization of I have post-traumatic stress disorder because of the trauma that I dealt with, and I was asking for services and help. I became homeless because of this trauma. I realized that the system was broken and wasn't really taking care of their vets. I was raped in the military, and when I actually went to speak out, I wasn't allowed to talk about it. So there was this anger that was built around what happened to me, but what was happening to others. And this is just a system where you're very dispensable. Once you're injured, you're not used anymore, and you become a veteran. People talk about the military as such a big system, but for me, I'm not there to break the system. I'm there to educate people who want to go into the system and know that these are the problems. Once you're aware of something and you have the information, it's easier for you to know how to deal with it afterwards. I wish I didn't have to deal with this trauma. I wish that I didn't have to go through this, but I do. And in order for me to survive and understand what I'm going through, I have to fight this. Not for myself, but for the other women and other men who are dealing with this problem. Because, I want this to end here. And if it takes me for the rest of my life to do this, then I will do it.
So that's Maricela, and she's really taught me that self-interest is at the heart of some of the most inspired activism. So often we think, what are the worst problems in the world, far afield from me, and how can I solve them? When in fact, we're experiencing things in our own lives every day that may be in dire need of social change and social transformation. So Maricela and the women who started the Service Women's Action Network have really demonstrated this in a huge way. The next woman I want to tell you about is Emily Apt. She is a filmmaker, but she didn't start out that way. She grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, quite wealthy family, a lot of privilege, but she grew up listening to hip-hop music, so she was sort of captivated by the stories that she heard through hip-hop lyrics and was really, in her own words, attracted to sufferings. She had sort of found herself just compelled towards it and didn't really know how to grapple with it. She went to NYU, women's studies major, did a bunch of different internships, et cetera, and when she was graduating, she said, okay, the most important thing I can do to end poverty, to be a force against injustice, is to be a welfare caseworker. I'm gonna work in the system, and I'm gonna help the poorest families in this country access what they need. Well, it turned out she hated being a caseworker, and not only did she hate it, but she was really bad at it, right? And those two often correlate. Many times when we reject something over and over again, it means it's just sort of not in our DNA. It's not something that we're naturally gifted to. It's not our natural inclination. And sometimes when you confront those things, it's really important to push through them, right? And to even resist your own narrative about how this isn't your thing, right? I think about young girls in math and the resistance to that. But sometimes it's about really recognizing when you followed a path that isn't the right one for you. Emily actually noticed that she was really jealous of all of these kids that she'd grown up with who she heard were making films. And I tell you that detail because I think it's so important. Jealousy is a very instructive emotion. It gets kind of a bad rap, but when you actually pay attention to who you're jealous of and why, if you can get underneath it, it's really usually about something that you're not giving yourself, right? It's actually not about that person. So she didn't really really care about who these guys were, but what she cared was they got to make films. And she realized that had always been her dream, but she'd convinced herself that she had to be a caseworker because it was the noble thing to do, right? So Emily went, totally switched course and decided she'd make a film about the welfare system, which was actually a really awarded, amazing documentary that helped a lot of people understand who the real people were who were receiving aid for the government. At this point, there was a lot of talk about quote-unquote welfare queens, right, people who didn't deserve any kind of safety net. And she really painted a very humanizing picture of who they were through these films and has continued to make films ever since that have illuminated the social issues that she cares so much about.
I never actively decided to be a social issue filmmaker, and I think that's because my films are social issue based just because they're a reflection of what I care about. I very much consider myself a public servant, and I think now I'm a public servant in filmmaker clothes, but in my heart I'll always be a public servant, I'll always be a caseworker, and that's what really motivates me. And you'll always see an element of that in my work, no matter what form it takes, whether it be commercial, documentary, fiction. The whole idea behind Take It From Me was to tell the welfare recipient side of the story, because they're so often demonized in mainstream media, and then with All of Us, which was about the disproportionate rate of HIV among Black women, that was sort of an invisible suffering. I think the really important thing for young people that are trying to do this work is that they figure out a way for the work to endure. When you're trying to do work that's difficult, that may not pay very well, the important thing is to not get overwhelmed by the enormity of what you're trying to do and focus on what you can accomplish realistically day to day.
So Emily has taught me to be an activist these days does not mean being a martyr, right? It means infusing your work with a creativity, with where you really light up, the things that really make you come alive, where your gifts are, because a lifetime of activism requires that kind of enjoyment. You actually have to have joy within the work you're doing. If you try to do something that you don't have joy in, you're not going to be able to sustain it. And I love this theologian who says, find where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need, right? So it's at that special intersection that you can really make the kind of difference that you crave. And another way to put it, which I love, is Howard Thurman says, don't ask what the world needs, ask yourself what makes you come alive. And then the rest of it is, and then go and do that, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So Nia Martin Robinson, environmental justice activist from Detroit, Michigan. It's very funny. I did a lot of, I cast a pretty wide net when I was deciding what 8 people to focus on in this book. And very often I would call people up and say, hey, I'm writing this book about young activists, I'm looking for people to profile, et cetera. And literally almost every single person I called would say, no, you don't want to profile me, you want to profile my coworker or my co-founder or my neighbor or anyone else. There's a lot of humility within this field. But Nia is the happy exception. When I called Nia and I said, I'm doing this book, et cetera, I'm kind of waiting for her to deflect, and she said, yes, this is my Oprah moment. She was convinced this is like, she was just gonna, blow up after this moment and be famous. I hope she's not too disappointed. I think she is more well-known than she was before. I am no Oprah, that's for sure. So Nia is just kind of like that. She's a joyful, playful person. She grew up in Detroit, daughter of 2 civil rights activist parents who actually were quite confused when she decided to pledge her life to environmental justice. They thought environmentalism, white hippies, right? They did not think that this was a cause that African Americans usually take on. But what Nia did in a really cool way is she sort of educated her own parents on the ways in which environmental justice issues are particularly critical for people of color, women and children to pay attention to, right? That the warming planet is affecting those in the global south, especially women and children of color, more than anyone else, even though they are disproportionately not as responsible for that warming. And so that it's such a huge role for Black people and people of color generally to play in this movement. She also sort of recast their own legacy for them. She said, you know, Martin Luther King's sanitation workers organizing was in fact also about the environment, right? We think of it as labor organizing, but it was also about the environment. So she had this really interesting way of kind of interacting with her parents and taking the legacy that she felt so lucky to have, but also kind of recreating it.
I think that sometimes as activists, we can get a little egotistical thinking that way, that I'm gonna save the world. I wanna do a small part. And so the environmental justice movement really allowed me to reframe environment and to know that my community, my city, my neighborhood is included in that definition, and it's not just some very beautiful, pristine rural area, but it's where I live also. I want to make sure that the world is good for me and the people that I love, because I know that that then translates into the world being better for everyone. There's so few of us, you know, in comparison to the masses or in comparison to the money and the manpower that our enemy is able to put out, that I absolutely can't give up. On top of it being a responsibility, it's like therapy, because otherwise I just hold it in and I cry and I'm sad, and I feel like I could really easily spiral into this state of depression if I didn't feel like on a daily basis I was doing something to make some sort of change.
That's Nia, and she taught me, as I said, that we're recasting the past and reclaiming our legacies, which I think is something that all of us, even if our parents weren't part of the civil rights movement, but part of other legacies of shifting as each generation is, whatever political spectrum you're on, whatever sort of your cause or issue is, that we're all processing what our parents did, what our grandparents did, and how we fit into that puzzle. Next, I want to introduce you to Raul Diaz. He works at Homeboy Industries, this incredible organization in Los Angeles. If you ever get a chance to go there, you should. And Raul was raised with 7 brothers, youngest of 7 brothers, single mother, at a time in the kind of mid to late 90s in East LA when there was just a ton of gang violence. And also a huge political reaction to that gang violence, which was a lot of incarceration of teenage kids that were getting caught up in it. There was even a term coined during that time, the super predators, which, you know, were actually like 16-year-old boys, right? But the idea was that these kids who were armed and dangerous were out on the streets and needed to be incarcerated just like adults. So a lot of them got pretty serious and damaging sentences that were in prison for quite a while. Raul was not one of those people. He had a couple pivotal things that happened in his life that helped him go a different way, the path less taken, as it were. And so he ended up actually becoming a social worker who helped, kids like his brothers, kids like the women and men he grew up with, get out of prison and sort of readjust to normal life. And you really get a sense when you talk to Raul about how challenging that was for a lot of these kids. I mean, you can imagine your own selves, you're somewhere in your late teens, early 20s. Imagine if you had been institutionalized at 14, 15 years old and not gotten out for 5 years. So you've never had access to a cell phone, you've never gone on a date, you've never had a job. You just are starting fresh and starting so far behind so many other people, probably not use the internet a whole lot. There's so many ways in which these kids are deeply disserviced by being institutionalized. So Raul basically created his own ministry of social work. He kind of made it up because he never went to school. He just knew the neighborhood and he knew how to intuitively figure out what people need. So I'm going to read you a little section of Raul's. Raul says he wants to take me to lunch for some, quote, real Mexican food. We sit across from one another in a booth sipping on giant drinks, Coke for him, horchata for me, and talk about his clients. There's something about the blaring Spanish music in this Mexican mall, the chaos of all the vendors selling cheap toys and cowboy boots and knockoff bags that make it feel safe to speak on such difficult subjects. The chaos surrounds us like insulation. The guys have 3 minutes to eat sometimes, 5 minutes to shower. They're not treated like human beings, Raul explains, the anger visible on his face. He and 2 other case managers at Homeboy Inc. are currently nearing the end of a 2-year grant from the Department of Juvenile Justice, the purpose of which is to help young people from the LA County area between the ages of 18 and 25 re-enter the real world after incarceration. Raul's caseload of 60 is filled with hardcore guys, murderers and drug offenders. The public defender's office started referring the most difficult cases his way after realizing how successful he was at cracking their previously impenetrable facades. Raul's job description is technically case manager, but rehumanizer sounds more appropriate. What he does with his clients goes far deeper than preparing their re-entry plans, housing, job training, mental health services. He meets with them frequently, gets to know them through a series of intuitive questions about the relationships they've had. Where's your dad at? Usually in prison or missing. Where's your mom at, if no mom? How was your foster care? How was your social worker? Raul will talk with them about baseball, the never-ending drama with the corrections officers, most of whom don't like Raul because he tries to circumvent the prison bureaucracies, their families back in Boyle Heights, even their crimes. Raul is all instincts. He describes an exercise that he made up and uses frequently with clients to get them to reflect on their crimes. I pretend to be the victim. I kissed my daughter this morning, hugged my wife before I left the house, headed out to get a loaf of bread and some milk, and your punk ass came on the bus stop and robbed me at 4 a.m. Do you know what it was like to have a gun in my face? When you robbed me, you robbed my pride. You took away my balls. At this point, some of his clients will still act hard about it, at which point Raul breaks out the mom card. How would you feel if it was your mom standing at that bus stop at 4 a.m. and some hardcore guy came and put a gun in her face? You rob people of their freedom when you do this shit, dog. You make them feel like they can't be safe in their own community. So you tell me, should you get parole yet? Many of them will simply say no, their eyes softened by the mention of their mothers, the gangster mentality, as Raul referred to it, cracked. Some say yes, the ultimate punishment is to parole me. I got nobody. That's where the relationship really starts, Raul reports. That's when I really gain their trust because they know that I see the truth about what they've done and I'm still going to care about them.
If I could spread the message that, hey, we're not all gang members. Not everyone is trying to kill you. No one really wants to kill you. Let yourselves be kids and enjoy the city. The reason why I continue, I said my son's gonna be a teenager someday. And if I don't do this, who else is gonna do it in Boyle Heights? Homeboy Industries has been around for 23 years now. Homeboy provides services such as tattoo removal, family counseling, individual counseling, job readiness training, and a job development agency. Sometimes I like to call myself a floater because I walk around the building and there's people who need help there. My job is to help out the individual, help out their kids, and help out their families. And once they get through our doors, it's our job, my job as a case manager, to guide that person through every aisle, every hallway, and walk them in through every door they need to be successful. You have to gain trust and you have to be peaceful and respectful to every human being you're gonna work with out there. You're not alone, we're here for you. Those are the type of things that I have to remind myself every day when I go to Homeboy Industries. It's about giving people hope that we're vulnerable, that we're down and out of luck. As a case manager, that's what I do.
So as I said, Raul really taught me that, sometimes there are these big dehumanizing systems and it can be overwhelming to think about how you might do anything to disrupt that system, and there are needs for system disruptors, redesigners, policy thinkers, but there's also such a need for people who are just going to rehumanize those dehumanizing systems. Just be someone that right in that moment connects with the person, looks them right in the eye and tells them that they care about them. The next person I want to tell you about is Rosario Dawson, the only quote-unquote famous person that I talked about. Hey, dudes in the front row over there, at least if you're going to be on your phones, go further back so I'm not seeing it the whole time. Okay. So Rosario Dawson, some of you might know, has anyone seen films with Rosario Dawson in them? Not as many as I thought. I bet you have, you just don't realize it. She has this new one out with Chris Rock that just came out like last month, I think. Rosario Dawson is a really interesting person because she's basically traveled the full spectrum of economic class in America, right? She started out as someone literally living in a squat in New York City, where her mom basically put the plumbing together, where she would sort of run up and down the floors and was kind of raised by the proverbial village. They weren't paying rent, they weren't even supposed to be there, right? And now she's, in Hollywood. She's one of the best paid people in America, that very narrow slice of elite, incredibly wealthy people. And so what's so interesting about Rosario is that she's actually not grappling with the lack of power, which is what we think of when we think about social justice issues, right, is how can, power to the people, but actually she's grappling with an excess of it. She feels like this chosen person. She was discovered on her stoop as a teenager and has had this wild trajectory, so she really has to grapple with what that means, what it means to have wealth, what it means to have the power of the platform that she now possesses.
Successful, but I got recognized on my stoop when I was 15. It was an incredible opportunity and I ran with it, but that doesn't actually make me that much different than any of the other girls in my neighborhood. For me, getting that job was more than just like, wow, I could be a star and all of this. It was a job. And it was like, this is an opportunity I recognize, and I'm not stupid. I'm gonna take this as far as I can take it. I feel really lucky actually having been exposed to, especially growing up in a squat, being exposed to so many different types of activists and people. My mom working at Women's Inc. and recognizing, yes, it seemed like Women's Inc. had limitless resources, but the reality was it was a bunch of really poor people reaching a hand out to other really poor people. I know what my mom was bringing to the situation. She had nothing, but she had a home and she had her kids and she was in a violent relationship, and that was enough to make her feel like she had a surplus to give to someone else. I want to make sure that I'm as effective as possible. And it's hard because I care about so many different issues. One side, I'm asked to be a part of stuff, and it's sometimes shocking to me how little they care if I know about the issue, which makes me really have to draw the line and say, no, I'm not going to be a part of that, because I want to know what I'm doing and not just be one of those celebrities on a red carpet saying something that actually hurts the cause.
So, of course, we in this room are not famous, but we do have power, right? Depending on the home you grew up in, the skin you were born into, they're all different kinds of privilege, your gender. And so Rosario is an example of really grappling with that privilege, of really thinking about your power and how to process what it means to have a lot of it, what it means to use it wisely. Tyrone Boucher is also someone who had to really come to terms with what it means to have a lot of power. He actually had an experience that many of us would think you would fantasize about, which is finding out at 18 years old that he had a $400,000 trust fund. How many people would love to hear that news, right? We all raise our hand, we all think that would be the best thing ever. Tyrone had a really interesting and actually sort of characteristic reaction, which was he just tried to block it out. He said, it's like, I don't even want to think about it because I feel like it's just going to screw me up. Like it's just going to divert my path in a way that I think could be really damaging. So he basically compartmentalized it, went off to Stanford, brilliant kid obviously, was there for one semester, decided to drop out, and start just traveling around the country as basically like a modern vagabond, right? Hooked up with a bunch of other people, and they would just hang out and basically try to live this sort of anarchist lifestyle off the grid. But meanwhile, this whole time, Tyrone's not telling anyone that, in some bank account somewhere, he has $400,000 with his name on it. He's sort of acting the part. And slowly that just ate away at him, and he just felt like, how can I not be honest with these people that I've come to love, that is my community, about who I am and what I have. And actually ended up hooking up with this organization called Resource Generation, which is helping wealthy kids with trust funds who want to problematize, who want to really get honest about the wealth that they have and figure out how to leverage it to make the world better.
Capitalism tells us lies, It tells us that we need to accumulate endlessly in order to be safe. It teaches us to strive to accumulate endless resources. And it teaches us not to look for security in relying on each other, in depending on each other, in supporting each other, in building community. And to me, that's where real security is. It's crucial for people who have privilege to talk about how it's not just because we're better. It's not just because we worked harder. Nobody's labor is worth 4,000 times more than somebody else's labor. The more money we have, the more we think we need, right? But we don't need it. Rich people don't need money, We already have privilege. Like, we already have cultural capital. We have education, we have healthcare. Like, it's not like I'm gonna give away my trust fund and then suddenly become destitute. There's no risk of that. I think of myself as trying to maybe infiltrate a little bit into philanthropy. But for me, I feel like just the act of doing the work, just the act of challenging the lies that we're told and the systems that separate us, like I said, it's just a humanizing process.
So Tyrone has really taught me a lot about the lines between those being served and those serving are being blurred, right? One of the things that he was involved in is this big collective effort to get a bunch of funds down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And the philanthropists involved in that, young trust fund kids, realized very quickly they didn't know people in New Orleans, right? They didn't have real connections there. So it was in their best interest to organize other rich kids they knew to get their money and then give that money to a foundation in the area that already knew the grassroots activists doing work, right? And so there's a lot of kind of intricate and complex thinking like that that can really totally shift the nature of philanthropy from something where it's, you know, rich people dictating what poor people should do into rich people saying, we've got a resource which is money, you've got a resource which is your community and your knowledge about what will make people's lives better. Let's actually collaborate, right? So it sort of changes from a hierarchy to an even playing field in a really profound way. The last person I'm going to tell you about is Dina Simmons. When I interviewed Dina, she was a teacher at Urban Science Academy in Bronx, New York. Born and raised in the Bronx, twin sister named Dana, older sister, single mom, grew up in a very small apartment. And she, you know, grew up in the Bronx, but from a very young age, this is the poorest congressional district in the country, her mom instilled in her education, education, education. So Dina knew that that was going to be a huge part of her life. She ended up through a series of scholarship programs getting to go to a private high school and then to Middlebury College, where she really thrived. And after Middlebury, she decided to come to the classroom, and she was actually a Teach for America fellow back in her hometown of the Bronx. And you know, Dina's just an amazing person. I found her because I asked another teacher friend of mine, hey, who's the most talented teacher you've ever seen in the classroom? And can I contact them? And this guy, who was very discerning, said in 1 second, Dina Simmons, and gave me her number. I was like, wow, that was like, you didn't even skip a beat there. So I called her and I asked her if I could come hang out. And she was a little curious, like, what does this like reporter want to come hang out in a 7th grade, 6th grade classroom? But she let me, and what I found there was just the most amazing thing. It was like she'd be in the middle of a math assignment and be like, okay, so the sine and the cosine, and then some kid would just yell, I love you, Mrs. Simmons, and she'd be like, I love you too. So anyway, back to the geometry that I'm trying to teach you. But it was like the whole classroom was just infused with a sense of really tight-knit community and true like love between her and her students. She knew their real lives, she knew their parents, she knew their brothers and sisters. She knew that this one was struggling with depression, you know, this one was having allergy problems, this one was in between homes. You know, she really knew their stories. She had a tremendous investment in them. And one of my favorite experiences reporting for this book was that she decided she was going to rent a van with her own money and take her class to Middlebury College in Vermont because she wanted them to have the sense that they deserve to be in college and this is what college can look like, et cetera. So, you know, she invited me to come along. I said, great. She said, we're leaving at, you got to be at the school at 6 a.m. Well, I lived in Brooklyn at the time, and that's like a full hour and change ride on the subway. And I thought, there's no way she's going to get a classroom of kids already at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. Like, I can get there at 6:15, 6:30. So I roll up with, you know, my hoodie on, my giant coffee, like totally exhausted. And all of her students are standing there in their Sunday best, ready to go, waiting for the jerk journalist who thought that they wouldn't all be totally ready. They were so psyched. And that, to me, was such an indication of who Dina is and what she inspires in her students. Seeing them run around the Middlebury campus was an amazing sight.
I had to be realistic about what I can do. I knew that as a teacher, like, I could not, like, decide, hey, you know what, I'm here and I'm going to change the whole system. So I had a little bit more micro perspective, and I said, hey, I'm here. I'm going to change the lives that I have right in front of me. And by changing the lives right in front of me, I'm going to build a collective of potential activists. Teachers are always asking me, Ms. Simmons, how do you get your kids to sit down and listen to you? And I said, that's because I'm Dina Simmons to them. I'm not the social studies teacher. I'm not the math teacher. I am a person to them. And I think you're most effective when you bring yourself and your humanity to the work that you do. I think the classroom is everywhere. I don't think the classroom leaves once they leave my door, because my students called me, they text me, they G-chatted me. They needed me even outside the classroom. It was hard, like, for me, because I'm like, okay, where's my personal life and where's, you know, my professional life? But I think when you're teaching, that's something that you have to realize. You're responsible for other people's lives, and sometimes your students are going to need you when they leave the classroom.
So Dina's big concern is really about not just the classroom, but as she's talking about those intersections that come in from outside the classroom, right? The education doesn't end at the classroom walls. And so she pursued an EDD, which is the equivalent of kind of a PhD in education, in health and education, and now is working at the Yale Center for Social Emotional Learning. And she's really interested in kind of the mental health of kids and how that often, particularly in poor communities, can get in the way of their learning, that it's not just about getting them to take the test, but sort of what are they bringing to the table in terms of their mental readiness, of their mental health to that classroom, which I think is really amazing. Okay, so enough talking from me. I want to wrap up here and then turn to questions. I think what I've really understood through this investigation is that everything is so interconnected, and therefore it can be very overwhelming. I love this John Muir quote. When we try to pick anything out by itself, we usually find that it's hitched to everything else in the universe, right? So you think you're an environmental justice activist, but you're really a racial justice organizer also. Or you think you're doing education, but you're really doing health and closing the wealth gap and everything else, right? So it doesn't really make sense to think of yourself as someone who just, sort of attaches yourself to one specific cause, because everything is interconnected. It makes more sense to invest in this idea that you figure out what your gift is to give. A lot of people have called this generation apathetic, and I actually think it's more accurate to say that we're overwhelmed, right? A lot of people sort of check out of the process of creating social change, but not because they don't care, but because they just can't figure out where to start. It seems so overwhelming, they can't figure out how to really measure their effectiveness. Parker Palmer, who's one of my favorite thinkers, says, absolutism and relativism have ravaged not only the things of the world, but our sense of the knowing self as well. We are whiplashed between an arrogant overestimation of ourselves and a servile underestimation of ourselves. But the outcome is always the same, a distortion of the humble yet exalted reality of the human self, a paradoxical pearl of price. Which in simpler terms just means it's easy to feel like you're in that pendulum that I was on, swinging from a big ego where you're taking yourself really seriously and looking for a very transactional kind of relationship with your activism. Where are the wins? Where are the wins? Where's the recognition? To this place where you actually think you have no power, where you don't even analyze the privilege you have and how you can leverage it to make the world a better place. And we have to find that middle ground if we're going to sustain lives of good intention. And I really became obsessed with this idea of good failure, right? Because I'd been so focused on success, and I realized the much more productive focus is good failure. Cornel West says, of course it's a failure, but how good a failure is it, right? How can you fail better all the time? How can you fail smarter all the time? How can you use your failure to become someone that you're proud to be? And Rebecca Solnit says, all revolutions fail because they set their sights heaven high, but none of them fail to do something, that this is really the long game, and we live in a world of, the sound bite and the 10-second attention span, so it's hard to think about the kind of generational change that we've benefited from. Has anyone in here seen the movie Selma? Guys, you gotta go see Selma. What's going on? Is it not playing in the theaters here? All right, well, you should torrent it online or something. I advocate that you steal Selma. Sorry, Hollywood. It's an amazing film, and I think in part it's so amazing because it really, at this moment when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and Eric Garner and all of kind of the racial justice issues that are being surfaced, it shows that this is many, many generations back. We've been having these conversations in new, vital ways, but that we're part of this very, very long story. So these are all the activists. I actually got them all together, and we hung out and made those videos and sort of traded best practices. It was a really joyful experience. Patience has its limit. Take it too far, and it's cowardice. I think we can get really good at just analyzing, and sometimes we have to jump in and try and take a risk and potentially fail. I'm just going to end with a quote from the book that I hope will speak to you. The strangest thing happened on my way to my 30s. I realized that I wasn't going to live forever, and it made the prospect of paralysis, the option of overthinking and wallowing in my own disillusion about what I'd been told, in contrast to what I was observing and experiencing, all seemed like a whole lot of wasted time. Certainly there is need for reflection, research, self-examination, before we just too enthusiastically jump into doing good. But we are also a generation with a tendency to stew. We've learned how to analyze well, perhaps too well thanks to our curriculum, critical thinking, and our hardworking teachers. We can intellectualize solutions into tatters with our finely sharpened swords of cultural relativity, and it's honorable that we've got those skills, that we're not afraid to use them. But as George Jackson said, patience has its limit. Take it too far, and it's cowardice. We must be fearless in our analysis and our action. We must accept that we will fail and try anyway. Try to fail always more exquisitely, more honestly, more effectively. We must wake up in the morning naively believing in the power of our own dreams and potential, of our own gifts, and go to bed exhausted and determined to do it all over again, with maybe just a bit of a different tactic, a little less ego, a little more help. What else are you going to do? Give up? Of course you're not. You're not going to do that because you're part of a long line of people who didn't do that, because you live in a country that was actually founded on the assumption that you would be audacious and rebellious and inexhaustible in your pursuit of a more perfect union. You're not going to settle because you've seen how that kills people, how resigning and consuming and forgetting are surefire ways to deaden a soul. You're not going to give up because it would be terribly boring. You're not going to give up because you owe the world, this nation, yourself, bravery in the face of suffering, vision in the face of stagnancy, and blood, sweat, and tears in the face of injustice. The good failure is your debt for being here, now, in this beautiful, horrible place. We have the opportunity to live our lives consciously in spite of all the soporific influences, to act even when we know how complex the prospect of doing so is. Our charge is not to save the world, after all. It is to live in it, flawed and fierce, loving and humble. As children of the 80s and 90s and aughts, we are uniquely positioned to fail. The bureaucracy we face, the scale of our challenges, the intractable nature of so many of our most unjust international institutions and systems, all of these add up to colossal potential for disappointment. No matter. We must strive to make the world better anyway. We must struggle to make our friendships, our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, and our nation more dignified, knowing that it might not work and struggling anyway. We must dedicate ourselves each and every morning to being the most kind, thoughtful, courageous human beings who ever walked the earth, and know that it still won't be enough. We must do it anyway. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so lay it on me. Questions, thoughts?
Three women writers, Naomi Klein, Climate Change Changes Everything, a book of a few months ago. Elizabeth Colbert, the staff writer for The New Yorker, The Sixth Extinction, probably the best book of 2014, and she had a previous book a few years ago called Field Notes from a Catastrophe. And then Catherine Hayhoe, the Texas Tech climatologist, Nobel laureate, and Time magazine chose her as one of the most influential people in the world in this past year. They all essentially say that global climate change is just not one of many issues. It's the issue that will overwhelm everything else. We don't need to save the world. The Earth will survive climate change. It's whether or not human civilization will survive. And it's more than environmental justice. It's a matter of survival, at least according to these three women. And I'm sure you're familiar with all three of them. If you'd respond to that, I'd...
Well,
yes.
I've
been involved in this issue for a very long time.
Yeah.
I was in utility regulation. Before that, I was a NATO's raider with regards to the proliferation of nuclear weapons after India and Pakistan developed atomic weapons from the peaceful technology they got from us. And President Nixon promised 1,000 nuclear power plants in the United States for the year 2000. We did initiatives in a number of states. We failed at all of them, but we won the war.
Well, first, we should say thank you for your work, right? This is the kind of generational stuff I'm talking about, is that people have hung in for this kind of work much longer than those of us who are in this room and are a little younger. So thank you for your work, sir. I think, yes, this is sort of the #1 concern that should be on all of our minds. And I would just add that I think one of the reasons I so admire Naomi Klein's work and other writers like her is that they're really combating what I think is a failure of imagination on the part of people who don't see themselves as affected by this yet and don't understand the implications of the effect in a way that translates into their daily lives. I think, it's part of that soundbite attention span thing I was talking about, that it's very hard for us to think of problems that we are already seeing the effects, but people have a failure of imagination of linking those to the climate change issue. So a lot of it is about education, but also really having the audacity to think about yourself as part of a 200 or 500 or 1,000-year present, right? Like, what are your kids and your grandkids going to experience? So we need better storytellers about climate justice. I mean, I think you named a few wonderful examples, and we also need ways to create urgency with those stories. Over here.
I actually have two questions for you. First, inside your book, you mentioned that you studied abroad in South Africa to learn more about the apartheid and how race is seen down there. I was wondering how that experience down there has you view what's going on in America and around the world today with races. And I also have a question about, you said that the youth today is being overwhelmed by what we are seeing in the media and what we are learning in school and this entire idea of changing the world. And I was wondering how you think we can stop becoming overwhelmed and start learning how to focus on one specific thing that we see instead of gathering all this information and feeling helpless, and how we can become angry again, and how we can become people who want to do things because of that anger instead of just being scared by all the bad that's going on in our world today.
Okay. Awesome questions, dinner homie. So I would start with the last one first, which is I think one of the ways to stave off overwhelm. I mean, first of all, one of the things I've really learned to do with myself is when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I ask myself, am I taking myself too seriously? And usually the answer is yes. And by that I mean, am I taking the details of life too seriously? Am I kind of blowing up in my own head my own personal dramas, or what's going on with my friends, or like, is it okay to have college debt? What's going to happen? Like, it's all going to be okay, and you are both the most special, unique snowflake in the world, and your personal shit really doesn't matter, right? Like, that's the hard paradox to hold, but it's the one that a lot of young people don't hold very well, myself included. So I think part of it is really, when you're overwhelmed, stepping back and saying, like, how serious are some of the things in my personal life that are overwhelming me? And then when you make space from your personal life, you can actually think about, like, what's my role in Black Lives Matter, or how can I create change right here in Texas in terms of the education system, the stuff we were talking about at dinner, et cetera. So I think it creates more space for you to think about other people and think about your role in it. And I think the other thing that staves off overwhelm is that thing I was talking about, that's really figuring out what your deep gladness is, right? So what's your unique way of interacting with the world? In your case, it might be music, right? So your gift is music. So how do you apply that to whatever cause you might care about? Whether it's, creating a program with low-income kids in schools around music so they can see their talent. If it's, providing self-care for activists who are totally burned out, and you play the cello for them and, like, light up their day. It could be a million different things. So really getting to know yourself and figuring out how to apply that rather than thinking you have to know everything about everything, right? That can sort of help the overwhelm. I'll briefly say my experience in South Africa was one of the most important things I ever did, in part because I went there thinking, like, oh, the racial situation in South Africa is so intense. It's going to be this great laboratory. I'm going to learn so much. And I lived with a family in a township, and my little sister, like, one of the first days I was there, was like, so in America, like, everyone of every different race just lives side by side? And I was like, no. And then she kept asking me questions, and I was slowly sort of unraveling, like, wow, I've been thinking, like, South Africa's this screwed up place, but really the US has almost all of the same things happening, but in non-legalized manners, right? Like, no, we just choose to live in totally segregated, towns, and we just think it's just an economic problem that some schools have a ton of money and some schools have none. We don't call it apartheid, right? So it was this huge wake-up call for me, both in terms of the racial issues happening in America, which I think happens for a lot of people who study abroad. You learn more about America than you do the place you're living in, because it just provides that contrasting experience. But also because I did a activist project while I was there. I taught spoken word poetry in the township high school that I was living in, and I was actually hanging out and had met this group of guys who lived in the township who were my age, and we were going out dancing and to bars and stuff, and one of them was a rapper, and I said, I'm going to teach this spoken word poetry class, do you want to come and just like co-teach it with me? And he's like, well, I've never like done any teaching, but I guess I'll come. His name is Melisizwe, and he came, and very quickly I realized, like, I am not the person who's supposed to be teaching this class. Like, I do not know how to connect with these kids. I just showed up 6 months ago. Melisizwe actually grew up in this township and is doing the kind of art that we're talking about. Like, he should be the one teaching the class. So I sort of humbly walked to a chair, sat down at a desk, and shut up for the rest of the time. And I realized that it was the best thing I did, that sometimes there's such a deep power in knowing when to shut up and knowing when to put, which, you know, I should shut up right now because I'm talking too much, but knowing when to put someone else in the power of being a teacher. Because Melisizwe never would have showed up in that classroom without me bringing him there, so that was a really important thing for me to do, but he was the one who was supposed to be teaching. So for me, it kind of unlocked a little bit of wisdom that I've tried to carry with me around that. Thank you. Love your sweatshirt.
Thank you, it's new. I figured you would like it.
Yeah.
So one of the things—
It says, a woman's place is in the House and the Senate, in case you can't see it.
You know, political science majors gotta stick together, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, obviously being interested in politics, one of the things that is often said about our generation is that we don't care about politics, that we're apathetic about that. What are some things that you can recommend for us to get involved, especially with Texas legislation opening up and bills being proposed? How can students here at Texas Lutheran go out and get issues, you know, heard about and talked about?
Well, I mean, I would like flip it back to you in the sense that I don't know enough about local stuff that's going on, local organizing. I'm sure there are lots of people in this room who do and could answer that better than I can. I do know on the national level, there's a lot of really cool stuff happening. If you don't already know about Ultraviolet, do you know about that organization? So there's this new organization called Ultraviolet that's basically an online petition and more kind of platform for all kinds of women's issues. So they were the ones behind like getting the NFL to talk about their domestic violence policies after the Ray Rice stuff. They basically are just like continuously holding people accountable, both in sort of popular culture, but also on the political level. So that's something I would check out. I mean, I think there's a real wisdom in organizing locally on the ground, doing like real protests and, you know, marching, and all of the sort of old school stuff is still totally relevant and totally effective. But there are also a lot of really cool social media tools that are being leveraged by organizations like Ultraviolet to make these sort of national changes happen. You know, if you're into reproductive justice issues, obviously there are local chapters of all kinds of important organizations, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, et cetera. But more, I would hope there are other people in the room, and please come to the mic if you know of local organizations that are doing that kind of stuff, but I hope that helps. Yeah. Oh, one other organization is Make It Work. Check that out. It's also national, but they're doing really cool online work.
So earlier you were saying that our generation is seen as apathetic, but it's because we don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. Where would be a great place to start? Like,
let's just workshop it right now. So, what's your name?
Julie.
What is it?
Julie.
Julie. Okay. So what do you feel like you're really good at? And don't be shy in front of this group of people, because if you don't tell me anything, I'm going to find out what you're good at.
I'm good at knitting.
Knitting! That's awesome. Did you know there is a whole knitting activism circle?
Please tell me you're kidding.
I am not kidding. I'm not kidding. I live in Oakland, California, and if you walk around my neighborhood, there are like stop signs that are entirely knit. Like there's this whole, it even has a cool name. What is it? Craftivism. See, some people know about this, right? So, okay, this is just one idea, but if you really truly love knitting, you could look into what people are doing around craftivism, and you could be the TLU #1 craftivism disruptor. And everyone would be like, yeah. It's actually really cool. You should like Google it, because it's a very cool thing to stumble on. You're sort of like walking down the street, and all of a sudden you're like, what? Like this whole bike stop, like where people can park their bikes, is covered in knitting. Or like people also do like political slogans knitting and stuff like that. So you actually you really threw me a softball on that one, because there are really cool ways of engaging that particular skill.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi, my name's Trent Smith.
We took a selfie, right?
Selfie?
Oh, no, we didn't.
No.
Must have been someone that looked like you. I took a lot of selfies today, sorry.
Well, first I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I feel like a lot of the things you said really helped me out a lot with
oh,
all the
thank
questions
you.
I've been thinking about. But when I was 20 years old, I read Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. I don't know if you've read it. But
I have not.
It changed my whole life. And I began protesting everything from NSA surveillance to GMO labeling to standing in solidarity with Gaza and Palestine.
Wow.
And after a year and a half, I began to realize that nothing's changing.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be negative, but it's not. And B, I began to realize that these paid-for people in power don't have the authority to discuss my rights. And then third, I began to realize that literally is what I'm going out and doing is I'm getting people to go out and beg. And I wanted to ask you, I don't mean to be negative, but do you really see a point in protesting anymore?
I do. I mean, I really do. First of all, I mean, I think this is what I was talking about, the sort of transactional nature that, and this, you know, point we were talking about with climate change of seeing like the 200-year, 500-year, 1,000-year presence. And when you think about the world that you and I live in, it looks the way it does because a lot of people protested. I mean, there are huge, significant shifts in the fact that I can vote is the direct result of people protesting in the streets and starving themselves in prison. Like, that was very recent history in the scheme of like all of history when you think about it. The fact that, you know, there are people of color at this school literally is because people protested for access to education. So, I mean, it's hard, I think, for us when we're in our kind of normal life mindset, because we're just going so fast and processing things so quickly, to keep in mind how much things have actually shifted because of traditional organizing and protests, but they have. I mean, I totally understand your disillusionment, because that's where I have been and where I am at different moments. You know, I don't think this is like a journey where like you decide you're optimistic and then you're optimistic forever. I still have moments of feeling like, you know, what the heck use is all of this, right? So I think it comes in waves, which is why it's so important to be part of communities that can, when you're down, someone else can be like, look, I'm feeling optimistic this week, I'll carry the banner, you pick it up next week, that kind of thing. But I think one of the problems on the political, you know, you said like these political authorities who actually don't have any authority is because our political system is deeply, deeply broken. And that, I think, gets a lot of people feeling very cynical, myself included. The most inspiring work I've seen around that is stuff that this guy Larry Lessig is doing, who's trying to, you know, take the money out of politics and basically say, how can we recreate an actual representative democracy where special interest groups don't get to buy politicians, basically? Because it is disillusioning to go out and protest for people who, you know, don't even care about what you have to say anyway. You know,
my rights don't come from them. So
yeah, it's a very broken system. So I totally empathize, and I hope you are in community and in collaboration with people that can kind of help you sort of carry the banner until you feel ready to do so again. And I will check out, I'll check out that book. It sounds really important.
I really appreciate everything you said.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Hi.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I think we all do. Dr. Olson mentioned your history working with the American Dream, and that's a topic of personal interest. What I'm curious about, what does Rosario Dawson mean for the American Dream? What does her story mean for social mobility, economic mobility, in gender and in race? Is that just kind of a coincidence type of thing, or are we making progress in gender and racial situations as far as the American Dream goes?
Wow, what a great question. I mean, my first reaction is her story actually shows exactly why the American Dream is, as traditionally framed, so delusional, because she was literally discovered on a stoop. Like, if she hadn't been sitting on that stoop at that exact moment, she would not be an actor. She would be like a social worker in the Lower East Side or something, which would be awesome. She might have a great life. But the way her social mobility was completely the result of random fate and, importantly, extremely good looks, right? Let's not pretend that doesn't play a role. So in a culture that still is, you know, very focused on appearance, this beautiful young woman had the fate of being discovered on her stoop, right? So it wasn't hard work. I mean, if Rosario was here, she and I could totally laugh about the fact that I'm basically calling her lazy, but it was, you know, she works hard now, but she did not work hard for her success, right? So that doesn't really fit the American Dream idea that bootstraps, you know, you work hard and it's gonna happen. She was discovered and had this crazy life. So on that level, it feels like it disproves it. On the level of the fact that we do live in a country where crazy shit like that can happen, I'm like, you know, America is amazing. Like, those things do happen, and Rosario is someone who now can waltz into any institution in this country and say, you know, I could be a donor, whereas her mom didn't even go to college, you know? So on that level, I still find it captivating and sort of, it does feel like a quintessentially American story, even if it feels very anomalous. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. My only question for you was really, what would be like your thoughts or advice to everyone in this auditorium about like how to necessarily come and go out and try and save a world full of people that really don't want to really be saved? Like how to, because I feel like on subjects like these, like as people, we are all blind in so many ways on like what to do or how to solve certain problems. And there are a lot of perspectives that we all don't really look at or point out to solve this whole individual problem as a whole. So I want to know, like, how would you explain to me and everyone in here how to make a difference? Because with the idea of power, everyone here, as I'm sure, they aren't really sure on how much power they really have just by being a living soul in general. Right, right. Well, I mean, I think it's about starting where you are, right? So like, what are the things on this campus? I mean, they might even be smaller. They might be like, what are the things within your relationships, within your family, within your dorm that are bothering you, that you think are issues of social justice, right? And then your friend group, right? And then just kind of follow those concentric circles out. So what is it about this college that you think could be different? Who's not here and should be here? Why? What are the things you guys aren't learning? What are the struggles you have? And how do you create change right where you are? Or the neighborhood, right? I learned a little bit, because Dr. Hoffman is like tour guide of the century, about the neighborhood that this school is positioned in, right? What else is going on in the neighborhood, and how can you guys be a force for change within that neighborhood? To your point about when people don't want to be saved, I mean, I think that is such a critical wisdom, is to be able to, A, not think of it as saving anyone, right? To think of it as, I have a resource, which is like a college education or whatever other resources you might have at your fingertips. I have access to spaces like this where people can gather. I have access to a mom who's like an amazing cook who will make us like tons of good food for a meeting. Like whatever your resources that you bring are there. And then whoever needs other things, you say, okay, so what are your resources that you're bringing to the table? Maybe you know the neighborhood. You don't have money. You may not even have a home. You may not be able to make a home-cooked meal, but you have some great insights about what it's like to be in poverty at this moment in this town. And tell me, like, what do people need? How can we be helpful? So I think people want to be helped. They don't want to be saved, but more than anything, they want to collaborate. They want to have a sense that they're not pitied, that they're part of a process, not that you're up here and they're down here, right? So anything you can do to shift the conversation to reflect that dignity that each person has, no matter how much money they have, I think can be really transformational. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, last question.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
We live in a generation that's largely dominated by social media. Most of the people in here have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, other forms of social media that I don't have.
Why not?
Huh?
Why not?
Well, I don't know how to use it a lot of the
Okay.
times. I usually stick to Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
But mostly to read other people's tweets. But I'm just curious as to your opinion on whether or not you can change or save the world through the use of social media alone. Is it necessary to take a step further and go to protests, form different organizations, or just participate in nonprofits? Do you think that just social media is not enough?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely don't think social media is enough. In particular because most of the things that social media as a tool are really good at are very short, sort of time-constrained things. So you can create a bunch of fury over an issue and get a hashtag going, and everyone's tweeting, and like there's all this energy for it, and then it can die out very quickly. And so for the kinds of problems we're facing, the wicked problem of climate justice, racial justice, all these other problems, we can't burn out after like the one-day news cycle is done, right? These things have to really be extended. So in that sense, I think it's not enough. On the other hand, I have seen and been part of some of the most powerful, interesting social justice campaigns that have created real consequences using exclusively social media. So one example I'll give you is that Facebook had, there were some people who had created Facebook pages that were basically pro-rape. They were like these disgusting pages that people could like that were sort of like normalizing and actually even sort of celebrating sexual assault. It was like totally disgusting. And someone emailed Facebook and basically like reported the page and said, we have to take this off. And Facebook replied and said, we're not taking it off because we can't be in the business of like policing people's, sort of social interactions on our site. Meanwhile, they have like banned pictures of women breastfeeding and like a bunch of other things that they decided were worthy of being taken off, but they had somehow decided that violent rape content was like par for the course. And they actually made some metaphor where they said, we wouldn't tell people to stop making particular jokes in a bar, and that's kind of what our standard is. So big mistake, because they basically enraged all of the feminist internet. And not only that, so that became like a huge thing. It was, I think the hashtag was not funny Facebook. That became a huge thing, but then also they got all of the advertisers who advertise on Facebook to start pulling ads and saying like, until you take down these pro-rape Facebook pages, we're not gonna give you our money. And so the bottom line talks, man. It was like, next day, Mark Zuckerberg was like writing his own personal letter to the feminist internet saying, I apologize, bad metaphor, bad decision, like we're taking these pages off. So that's one of the most important corporations in modern times was pressured by whoever, like these random women on the internet who were pissed off, right? To me, that is one of the ways in which social media can be very effective. It doesn't mean that's the end of the story, right? What else is happening on social media around misogyny? It continues to happen, right? It's a long fight, but that one win to me demonstrates that there is a lot to be excited about with regard to social media.
Okay, thank you.
I'll see you on Twitter. Okay, thank you guys so much. Those were great questions. It's really been an honor to be here.
For more information, please visit tlu.edu.